All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our new Life as a Postdoc Seminar Series as a part of the Boston Postdoc Association. My name is Zeke Pisklich. I'm a co-chair of the Advocacy Committee, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Gary McDowell, who's giving our inaugural talk for the series. Gary got his PhD in oncology from the University of Cambridge in the UK, and then he did 2 postdocs in the Boston area, the first at Boston Children's Hospital, the second at Tufts. And since then, he's been involved in a variety of advocacy and consultancy efforts. Most recently, he became the CEO of Lightaller LLC, which provides expertise on early career researchers for organizations who are looking to hire, support, or otherwise involve current and future generations of budding researchers within their work. Today, Gary is going to talk to us about science of science, experiments in and sources of data about early career researchers. And Gary, if you'd like, take it away.
Great, thanks so much, Zeke. Thanks everyone for having me here. I'll have 2 logistical things. The first is that the Chicago Air and Water Show is happening, and every so often a low-flying military jet will pass over my house. So if you hear, and I think one is happening now, so if you hear that, please don't be alarmed. Everything is fine. The second part pertinent to the talk is I'm going to be talking about a lot of different sort of sources of data without going into them in too much depth. And I have a PDF that I will share, I think at the end of when I'm talking in the chat, that has links to all of the papers and all of the sources of data. So you don't need to worry too much about where all the things are or what have come up, but I'm sort of mentioning things as an example. So I will share my screen with you and get started. So, yeah. As Zeke mentioned, I have been working in the last, I guess now, 8 to 9 years, thinking about postdocs and data about postdocs. First, when I was a postdoc at Tufts was when this really started and was getting involved with the I guess the precursor of the Postdoc Association in Boston, the Pan PDA Council, as we were, and I co-founded the Tufts Postdoc Association at that time, and we started to have more Boston-wide conversations. And from there, I moved to a nonprofit, and now the role I'm in, where I work essentially as a consultant, and I like to call myself a freelance academic. This is a sort of a scattering of things in the space of thinking about data to do with postdocs that I have co-authored and been involved with. They go across a variety of different kinds of topics. I've sort of mentioned in the blurb for this talk, when I'm explaining to people what I do, I talk about the key issue, a key motivator for me, that we don't even know how many postdocs there are in the US. And we didn't know this 8 years ago, and we still don't know it today with much greater clarity. And I will say, you know, I'm from the UK. I sometimes go back or speak in other countries, and I will talk about how the data in the US isn't that great. And people in those countries will say, well, seems like it's better than ours. So there's a really interesting question I've been driven by, which is why do we not have better data about the people who are moving through the system, and particularly about postdocs? I think, you know, we collect data about the things that we care about, and we are a system that should be producing people who are trying to solve problems using research skills. And yeah, and that's sort of been a large motivator for me. So I'm going to go through a very high level view of various kinds of sources of data, some of the questions there are, what is being answered, what isn't, and really give you a sense of where to find data, given that there's not a really good concrete source. So I will start with, I'm going to start sort of at like a government level in the US, and federal sources of data. And the best sources of data that we have at that level are from the National Science Foundation. I put the NIH here in brackets. They have some data about the people that they consider to be their trainees, but that is the people who are on the National Research Scholarship Awards, or National Research Service Awards rather, things like F32s, T32s. they do not consider anyone else to be in their sort of training pool, but 85% of the trainees who are funded from NIH are on research project grants. So NIH has some data related to the people that it considers to be its trainees on its training awards, but not the people on research awards. For that, we have to go to NSF. And there is this census, which the shorthand title is the Graduate Student Survey, or GSS. And you know that acronym might give you a sense of who is emphasized in there, the graduate students, right? But essentially, this is a survey that is done every year for the NSF, where each university has to input data about its graduate and postdoc populations. So here's a plot that I put in a recent blog post, sort of looking at the effects of COVID, or discussing the effects of COVID on the number of postdocs. Here I have combined postdocs who are counted as postdocs, but also non-faculty researchers who are also counted, who I've combined all of these into the sort of the pool of postdocs and postdocs and other kinds of sort of associated postdocs altogether, who I'm calling doctoral degree recipients, just for shorthand here. So, you know, here's a simple graph showing that the number from 2014 to 2019 has been reasonably constantly increasing, and there was this drop in 2020. And, you know, I've sort of have been thinking about whether how big this drop is. You know, foreigners couldn't come to the US at that time, and so that definitely had an effect. But we expect that there might have been an effect of people staying in postdocs for longer. This happened after the Great Recession in 2008. And so, you know, I'm sort of discussing a little bit of that. The data here is not so much important as, you know, I just told you that there isn't a sense of what the number of postdocs is. But, you know, like Gary, you just showed us, there's a census. And when I show you this paper that we wrote, I guess it's now sort of 5-6 years ago now, this survey is a good sort of indicator of trends broadly, but myself and others have argued that it's a very unreliable indicator. And this paper was done in response actually to a paper published in 2016 that basically claimed that the number of postdocs was in decline. It used data actually from when I was talking about the Great Recession. There was a decline from 2010 to 2013 in the data in the survey, and the paper was based on a lot of faulty assumptions, I have to say, and in particular, they clearly didn't actually speak to any postdocs or anybody who had been a postdoc at that time to get a sense of whether this made sense. And we started to look into this data a bit, and we started to get excited because we were looking at the numbers. We were like, oh no, we think there's a straight line, a bit like the line I'm showing you here. But instead, from 2008 to 2010, people stayed, and then that number corrected back to the base, that original trend line, that there was a bubble of retention, that people hung around for longer. And talking to people, we heard that seemed to be the case anecdotally. People talked about having seen that in their own labs. But we actually had to abandon this suggestion to say that we couldn't even draw that conclusion, because when we looked at the data that had actually been provided by universities, it was not possible to actually make a good claim in any direction of what was happening on a nuanced level to the postdoc population. And a reason for this was, if I show you this plot here that I've made, this is a plot of the number of postdocs essentially at each institution. Basically, each institution, it's ordered from most to least postdocs along the bottom here. And each data point is just a single institution and the number of postdocs they have. And maybe you'll quickly appreciate, first of all, that this data is very much based on a small number of institutions who have a large number of postdocs. About half of these institutions, of about 230, I think, about half of them have certainly well under 100 postdocs at their institution. A lot of them have maybe 1 or 2, and it's a very long tail. There's one institution, which is Harvard, which I gathered together all of the Harvard institutions and hospitals at about 7,000 here. The next institution is Stanford, which is at about half, about 3,500. And then I think one of the University of California institutions, they moved at 2. But you see it sort of drops off here reasonably quickly. So First of all, the data is dependent on each of these particularly very big institutions giving correct data. And we found in the data set that there were places who would 1 year give hundreds of postdocs, the next year would give 0, the next year after that would give hundreds again, and these wild fluctuations in numbers from certain institutions. And that was because we posit variations in the ability to administer postdocs. This is a piece that I co-wrote about the various dozens of titles that postdocs have at institutions. The very fact that postdocs are often hired into a single lab, unlike graduate students who are hired into a cohort, and there's more centralization and more attention on the numbers. Postdocs are very, very disparate in the hiring and administration of their roles. And so that makes it very hard, even for institutions that are trying to keep track of this well, very hard for them to find the data from each department, from every part of their institution. And sometimes there would be one person at the institution who was doing this job, and sometimes they would leave and there wouldn't be a person doing that role the next year, or someone would be filling in and the postdoc data just didn't get entered. So the issue here being that there is this census, there is this thing that exists. It's probably the best approximation that there is of numbers for postdocs in science and engineering only, not in other fields. So that's sort of the first baseline that people go to. But I want to point out there's a number of caveats, and you'll find throughout this talk, actually a lot of what I focus on is on the caveats of the data, as much as what they can tell us, what we should be very careful of. There's other data that NSF collects too, which is more indirect, and can sort of give us pointers to what is happening to people who have postdoc. So for example, this data was for this report at the National Academies here. It's a very complicated figure, so I'll try to go through it very briefly, but to give you an idea of what's going on. It uses data primarily from a survey where a subset of people who did their PhDs in the US and who are still living in the US are asked where they are now, essentially. What role are you in? And it's sort of, this follows up at regular intervals, up to, I think, the age of 70 for people. So for example, there are time points here for each year, and for cohorts, for example here, this 1993 data point for the 1 to 5 years since PhD, this data is looking at people who got their PhD between 1988 and 1993 and where they are. In this cohort here, this 1993, this will be for people between 1983 and 1988. So it gives you a sense, 1 to 5, 6 to 10, 11 to 20, 20 plus. You get a sense over time of what each of these things are. And then these plots here show different kinds of roles, right? So let me explain, for example, this dark blue line here is given as academic non-tenure track. Most people 1 to 5 years are in those roles. These are postdocs, right? So this is the post, and other things like that too, but postdoc numbers. So it makes sense that a lot of people are in that role 5 to 10 years. You'll notice this blue line, also for 6 to 10 years. Over time, by 2013, this had become the major destination for people 6 to 10 years out. So suggesting the length of people postdocing, I'm careful here not to say the length of postdoc positions, but the length of people postdocing has increased over this time. Again, this data is now 10 years old, so the trends are probably continuing. The red line here, which is in 1993 for each of the cohorts, is the top destination. That's tenure track. You will notice the sad decline of that line in every cohort over time. The purple line, which is increasing in everyone and is the major destination for people 11 years plus from PhD by 2013. This is non-academic, non-research roles. And at the time of this committee, one of the topics of conversation was industry tends not to hire so many people into bench science as it hires into sales and marketing and managerial roles. So a lot of these kinds of things. So again, this will give you a sense of what kind of data there is out there. It's sort of, this isn't postdoc specific, but it sort of gets the broader population. And a lot of what we do, and the people of those of us who work in this space, is trying to cobble together various of these different things to get a big picture of what's going on. Also at the federal level, something I engaged in a few years ago now was working with the Census Bureau. So they collect data every 10 years on everyone, which includes some occupational data. They also have a survey every 2 years, the American Community Survey, and that is a deeper dive, but with a smaller subset of the population. But they then use that data with the federal national census data to sort of correct for the numbers and try and approximate and scale up what that data means for the whole country. And this is a really interesting collaboration. It was great in particular because you sort of get a sense of people's occupation and what they're doing, but it's tied to all of this other data. Some of which, we have age, so we were able to see the age of that increasingly the workforce is becoming younger. The people over here more over time from 1990, it's quite dramatic, even in 10 years, that there was this greater increase in the proportion of people working in the private sector, and that academia as a percentage and also in terms of numbers was somewhat on the decline. But also we got this great data to do with demographics. So for example, looking at the age of children, not too surprising, this is a conversation we've had for a while, but the postdocs tend to be in a position around the same time when they're trying to start a family. And this data, this was the first time really this data had been produced, actually showing this. Something that we knew, right? We all knew this, but this was really nice to see it. We got really interesting things to do with whether people were married and what the spouse was doing, because all of that data is in there too. And so, for example, we pulled out things like men are much more likely to have a non-working spouse than women are. And again, this has long been discussed as a possible way for particularly men to succeed, or for anyone to succeed when you have a non-working spouse, someone who's taking care of everything in your family at home. And of course, that traditionally falls into gender roles. It tends to be that there's a man working and a woman not working. And so men in their 30s were 7 times more likely to have a non-working spouse than women. And so these are all things that we brought in to sort of talk about, this is what the workforce looks like. And here are the sort of pressures that they're experiencing. We also were able to look at the diversity of the workforce, both in terms of race and ethnicity, but also in terms of immigration status. Quite dramatic change in the diversity, although depending on which population you're looking at, we actually had this feedback of, oh, the population of Black researchers or Black workers in the biomedical workforce have doubled, but it only went from 1% to 2% in a near 25-year period. So not a great sense of progress there. The workforce sort of doubled in this time, but you'll notice that in 1990, over 3/4 were US-born American citizens working in the biomedical workforce. They had become a minority by this point, and foreign-born citizens or non-citizens were the major component of the workforce by that point. So that's sort of giving you a sense of what federal government data exists. I want to move us down a stage and talk about what data are universities collecting. And I could talk for a very long time about the long history of trying to track career outcomes, specifically in the sciences and in engineering, and for people with PhDs. A group of us from Future of Research co-wrote this opinion piece back in 2015, talking about how really we should be tracking where people go. People graduate with a PhD and we don't know where they end up. And we're telling people, look at all these, you can do anything with a PhD, but at the same time, we're not going to tell you what that is. We're not going to tell you where people from our graduate programs have gone. You just will have to figure that out for yourself. And we sort of pointed out, this is maybe a little disingenuous. If we're so proud of the system of training people and also the people that we're producing, we should really be able to point to where they're going. So I will say one of the positive outcomes of this committee that I sat on, maybe the only real outcome I might argue from this committee that I sat on at the National Academies a few years ago, was the conversation that was held around this topic. And in particular, the chair of the committee, Ron Daniels, who I think still is the president of Johns Hopkins. He's a lawyer, but he's very interested in the biomedical system. And he really understood the argument, the moral argument for we should be showing where people are going. And we actually had a really fun public session where various people were brought in and forced to explain to us why they were not sharing their data. And myself and Jessica Polka, who co-authored this, we were both on the committee, and it was a lot of fun because we, of course, had talked about this for a long time. And it was really fun just asking people questions and then responding to them of why their answers were unreasonable, like it's too hard to do, or nobody has ever asked us, was my favorite one. Because our committee had responded to a previous committee where they had asked. And, you know, just to be clear, there's a lot of effort goes into tracking data of where people go who have undergraduate degrees from university, who have medical degrees, who have law degrees. The reasons for these are varied, but you'll notice that all of those people pay their tuition. And also medicine and law are famous for people earning a lot of money. So there's great interest in the institution in tracking those people, both from their like development, alumni, fundraising, but also in particular in the case of law schools went through a near total collapse in their recruitment for students about a decade ago. Because of this very issue, they were producing more law degrees than could be hired. And the feedback ended up that, yeah, people decided they're like, oh, there's no jobs, so going to law school is a waste of time. And so they decided they had to start tracking the data of where people went in order to prevent this happening again. So that was sort of a fun story. And from that, a group of universities did actually get together, again, led by Ron Daniels, to report student and postdoc outcome data. I can tell you what was interesting about being part of this effort was not only was I making sort of the moral case, Ron told me that he actually used me as a threat with various universities, as in, if you don't start publishing this data, Gary and his group will go and start collecting it themselves and publishing it. And we all know the data is bad, but it would be much better if you control the narrative and you're able to get that out. And if we get, you know, this group on side, and so, you know, they set up this whole website, they have this video, where they're talking about, you know, where people end up. It seems to be a problem loading here. Yeah. Oh, there it is. Okay. Yes, they had me in the video. You know, it's like very, very smart, very politically smart. Like, here, we're doing this thing. We're collecting the data. We're putting it out there. This is the right thing to do. We're patting ourselves in the back. And I was like, sure, great. Yes, I will come. I will be in your video. I will endorse this effort. Great. So that data, I've just put up an example. It's sort of by design, it is not all aggregated. It is each institution and they have their grad student outcomes and they have their postdoc outcomes. And they have postdoc outcomes in the case of statistics of who is at the institution and who was there, as well as career outcomes for where people have ended up. So it's sort of hard to compare across institutions. I think that's kind of by design, but there is a lot of interesting kind of data there and you can get sort of aggregate pictures of what is going on. And from looking through this, actually pre-pandemic, I haven't looked at it recently, but pre-pandemic, I saw that the median length of a postdoc position was 2 years. And that also the top destination after a postdoc was doing another postdoc. And a lot of this could sort of be explained by people are doing very short postdocs, like 6-month postdocs in the same lab where they were doing their degree. The reason for that is the pressure on time to degree. So there's this very common practice now of, oh, we need you to write up and be out of here because time is ticking, but just stay for a postdoc for another 6 months to do your paper. It's not really what the postdoc is supposed to be for. But this again was very helpful to start seeing. We know there are these practices going on, and it's really helpful to have the data to sort of figure out what people are actually doing in the system versus what is supposed to be happening. Often to, I mean, I am also this data. I did a 2-year postdoc at Boston Children's and then a 2.5-year postdoc at Tufts. And it seems quite common. A lot of people had an experience like me of having a not so great first postdoc and maybe a better second postdoc. And so that seems to happen a lot. And there's a lot of moving around. And of course, the more people move around, part of why we've been pushing for this data is that people graduate. We have really good data on graduate students. There's this data of, oh, you know, 5 years later, they're like in research, which means postdocing a lot of the time. And then after that, people dissipate away. And in this sort of movement of short-term contract positions that are unclear and poorly defined and not well tracked, people sort of dissipate away, and you sort of are able to deal with where has everyone gone? Well, we don't see people with PhDs begging on the streets, which is literally something the now acting director of NIH once said in my presence. We don't see PhDs begging in the streets, so it can't be that bad. So, so this to give you a sense what sort of things are out there, and also that there can be coalitions that form from these organizations when they have a mind to. And I've given you a sort of sense of a little bit of the politics behind, a little bit of moral argument. Overall, they sort of did the right thing on this front. And then the last thing is sort of moving down again is sort of grassroots or self-organized efforts, which can be, it can be grassroots advocacy things. They can be, again, at the level of individual institutions. There's sort of this rising interest in the academia of science, right? And of publishing things. People have realized you can publish papers on postdoc data or the lack thereof. And you can get, because there's very few people in this space, you can maybe get a fancy paper somewhere, or people try to game the system a little for their careers for that, or frankly that just it's interesting, and some of the data is quite easy to gather. It just requires a little bit of elbow grease, and maybe a lot of people doing something all at once can get a lot of data relatively easily. It's just gonna be a little burdensome, coming through websites or going through certain things. So for one example, of both of those kinds of things, there was this change to labor law that happened in 2016. That didn't happen in 2016. It was proposed and then never happened. And I won't go into the details of it, but it affected postdocs sort of indirectly or by accident. And it resulted in this change was afoot to do with postdoc salaries and whether institutions would raise the salary or whether they would try and have postdocs literally clock in and out. And so we were tracking, myself and Adriana, we emailed all of these institutions. We asked them basically one question, what are you doing, with multiple choice answers? And we tracked that over time, and we kept updating our site of what everyone was doing, who had responded and said what they were doing over time. So that's written up as a paper. And then from there, we were interested in salaries ended up going up for postdocs, even though the law didn't get updated. And so then we did this data collection effort using freedom of information requests for 2016 salary data. I don't want to talk too much about salaries because I know we have a talk coming up on that, but I just wanted to give you the sense of, we were able to do these freedom of information requests to the 40 odd biggest public institutions. Boston University also gave us their data very nicely. But we were able to get a certain kind of data set from a certain group of institutions. And, we wrote this up, and one of the key things that we found actually was that there was this significant gender pay gap for postdocs. Men were earning more than women. And in particular, it was significant in the Northeast census region and the South. So primarily sort of the East Coast. The Midwest and the West didn't have this. And, we found that salaries tended to be higher in the West overall. Some interesting little points. But again, sort of aggregate data, it was about 15,000 postdoc salaries, individual salaries. So, certainly not all postdocs, but it's certainly a good amount to be able to draw some general conclusions. I will talk about work here briefly that is not mine. I was not directly involved with, but University of Chicago, they've done more qualitative research. Everything I've talked about really is quantitative. They did the National Postdoc Survey, which maybe you have heard of. They did this, first of all, I think they administered the survey back in 2017-ish, around then. And then they recently did they were carrying out the survey again in 2019. And then, of course, took the opportunity in the pandemic in late 2020 of doing it again. So this was a substantial effort where they tried to work with a lot of different groups and sharing the survey. It's very hard to get people to fill out surveys. But it was a really great way of trying to, again, get a bunch of different pieces of information together about the experience that people are having. And then particularly it was interesting what that looked like in the pandemic. So just to give you a sense of future directions from my perspective, and sort of personally, I'm actually working on updating the postdoc salaries to do the last 5 years, 2017, 18, 19, 20, and 21. I also have some data from NIH on the intramural postdoc salaries. So the people who work at the National Institutes of Health in their labs. You'll be amused to know perhaps that the NIH also doesn't know how many postdocs they have working in their own institution, never mind how many they are funding. So that was interesting. But again, to give a sense of, they're obviously earning a lot more. They're on sort of federal scales. But interesting nuances in that data, for example, that they give people different titles based on whether or not they're foreign. So you can actually begin to parse out whether foreigners are earning more or less. And maybe even, it's a little hard because they won't give me the names, but there's a way of sort of trying to match data from various years together to try to see whether the salaries are going up for different groups in the same kind of way, and also how long people are postdocing for in different roles, whether foreigners are doing it longer or shorter. That might explain the lower salary if people are leaving earlier. So that kind of thing. So I'm still keen to work on the salary thing, and you'll hear more about that in a future talk too from Tim. The NSF data collection part and the graduate student survey, I'm working with a collaborator and in conversations with the NSF agency that works on this to try and start to put more attention on the postdoc census. Having pointed out all the things I talked to you about, they're quite responsive to hearing about this. So I'm hoping there's some movement in that direction soon. I'm also working on thinking about career outcomes tracking using things like ORCID, using bibliometric data. It's very hard to track where people are because we don't have a way of tracking where people go after leaving university. There's just not a great system set up for like keeping in touch with people or keeping contact with those people. And so there's a lot of arising questions of, we gave somebody a fellowship. Now, where have they gone 5-10 years later? Are they still in academia? Are they still, are they doing something relevant to the topic we were funding them on? What's going on? So ORCID is emerging as a source of some of that data, which I'm starting to explore. Yeah, and I continue to work on exploring novel sources, particularly thinking about the caveats that those sources have. I think it's very important not to make any grand pronouncements. You'll notice in anything that I write or blog posts or anything that I'm extremely cautious about making pronouncements about the population based on the data. But also, what can we say from it? What sense do we have? And does it in particular reinforce things that we're hearing? Like there are things that I hear when I speak with groups like you or I go to universities, and does this track with data that I know that's elsewhere? And sometimes those things will reinforce and you start to build up again a more holistic picture what's going on. So thanks so much for listening. And I'm happy to take any questions and chat with you now. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Gary, for that wonderful talk. If anyone has a question, feel free to, I guess, raise your hand and then unmute. Okay, we have a question from Mayank.
Hey, Gary. Lovely talk. I have a bunch of questions, but I'm not sure. Well, anyway, I'm just gonna go ahead. So you talked about NIH at like different points, right? And during the talk, like firstly, when you were talking with respect to NSF data gathering, right? And you had in brackets NIH, and towards then you actually mentioned that NIH do not have any system in place to track their own intramural postdocs. So I was just curious if NIH does have anything at all, or they do not.
They have, so they have there's NIH Reporter, in which you can essentially search for people who are, the principal investigators in the grants. So that way you will get the postdocs who have, these fellowships and these kinds of things. They also have an office of the biomedical research workforce that just recently has a new director. I knew the previous director in sort of my old nonprofit work. Listen, the issue with NIH is that they're very concerned about, they're sort of trying to do this political dance. And when they talk about the workforce, what they mean is the principal investigators. And so when you see a lot of concern about early stage investigators or early career investigators, they're talking about faculty. They're talking about people who are able to get R01s and all these kinds of grants. They are, with the exception, I think probably most particularly, some of the various institutes are more driven than others to be thinking about grads and postdocs. NIGMS is a good example. They very much think about training, and I think are really leading the work that trying to push NIH in what they're doing. So there is sort of this thing of not wanting to see the grads and postdocs. And I will very briefly give you sort of the history of this. In the 70s, the Nixon administration was a little annoyed that federal money was being used to pay for people's PhD training, especially at a time when people tended to go off into industry and earn lots of money with PhDs, which was happening at that time. They were sort of making a push that they should not be funded. And, you know, I can sort of see the logic, because we don't pay for people to go to medical school, right? So, you know, which I might argue is we do pay for residency through taxes, but not for medical school. So Congress disagreed, but they did see that the way that things are going at NIH, this was an unsustainable system where more people could be produced than would actually be able to get jobs the way it was going, because it was sort of, there was no sort of limit on how many people were being trained for positions. And so this was why the NRSAs were set up, to have a population of trainees to create a sustainable system. At the same time, the NIH kind of secretly, kind of against like what was being intended, allowed grads and postdocs to be on research project grants as staff. And this is where the trainee staff thing emerged, right? And part of the impetus that, again, like I can sort of sympathize that the NRSAs are only for Americans, right? Only for citizens. And so there was this argument of, well, we have all of these foreign researchers, we want to attract people from other countries. They have to go on research project grants. I can also tell you that all of the K awards could all be open to foreigners if NIH wanted. They have the power to do that. They only do it for the K99 and I think for the F99 K00 at NCI. But all of those could be. The NRSAs, it's a little more complicated. That could also be changed through some, you know, lobbying to the executive branch, not to Congress. It's to do with the executive branch. So, you know, what I'm trying to communicate is that it's hard to get that data because they're kind of trying to make it hard, you know, in my opinion. So it's a little, yeah. The NIH is a little more tricksy. The NSF has this data and is responsive to moves to improve it because it's actually part of NSF's mission to be collecting this data. So they are essentially mandated to be doing this. So that works better. But when you try and have these conversations with NIH, in my experience, it tends to be, you know, nobody wants to see, everyone knows what the problem is and nobody wants to actually be able to point to it, is my perspective. So it's yeah, it's a little hard. Most of the trainees funded by NIH, you cannot see from NIH data. You have to go to NSF and get it that way.
Yeah, I mean that's like just a very opaque system, right? I mean, yeah, and also very complex. So it has multiple problems out there. In your opinion of like, you know, from a grassroots perspective, trying to sort of going out to different institutions and gathering data, what's your sense of in the US, what other institutions or universities which might be doing good at collecting data and what their system's like? And can we learn something from those systems and sort of establishing sort of at least a US-wide system?
Yes, right. And that raises a good point that institutions are also competing with each other. So University of Chicago doing the National Postdoc Survey. I'm in the Midwest, right? I'm in Chicago now, and I lived, I was in Boston, I was in San Francisco. One thing I noticed being in the Midwest is people tend not to come to the Midwest. They want to go to the coasts. They want to go to Boston, New York, San Francisco, Bay Area. Chicago does pretty well, but there are places around this part of the country who are trying to attract people and don't get as many applications and this kind of thing. So I have seen some of the most interesting conversations actually happen in institutions like that. And who sort of have, University of Michigan actually is a great example, I think. When we were talking about the career outcomes data, Michigan was already doing this. They had this very fancy setup with Tableau on a website. And I sort of like enjoyed what they were saying. They're like, all these other institutions want to like hide their data. That's fine. We're showing grad students, potential grad students, that our people get jobs and where they get jobs and what those jobs are. And it's attracting good people here. So they're like, honestly, if everyone else decides not to reveal their data, it's actually working out really well for us. This is the sort of thing. The politics, the drama around who's claiming credit for being the best at collecting data sort of emerged in this time. At UCSF was like, well, we were doing this, and at Stanford was like, well, we have been doing this. And it sort of became this interesting little like fight between places of who was doing it best out of the few who were doing it. So that, and of course, there's an interest now that the narrative has shifted a little. Everyone knows the system is bad, but there's a great interest if your institution is doing a little better than the national average of like being able to point to that, right? So so there are places that are doing things better. I've had great conversations with Sarah Hokanson, right, at Boston University, and I think Boston University has done some really cool stuff. MIT does some pretty good stuff actually with the tracking as well. I will say when we had all the institutions who were joining this coalition of institutions to collect data, there were certain institutions who were just not interested. For example, Harvard and Yale, because they don't need to, right? Because people go there regardless. So I think understanding the institutional context gives you a sense of like what places are trying to do better and be seen to do better. Not just on data collection, but on all sorts of fronts, like mentoring or like, treating people better. So yeah, there's great variation. And part of what I'm hoping to do with this project with NSF and the data collection part, we recommended with our paper of, talking about the NSF, the standard of the NSF data, we're like, maybe we should just have a subset of universities that are doing this really well, and we should use that data as like a sort of a national like indicator, right, of postdoc numbers. Just have a subset, because it's, so many places are like doing it to so many different standards. If we have a few who do it like quite well, right, then we can pick on those. So there is, yeah, there are various places doing these things better. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Is there anyone else who has a question? Ian, go ahead.
Hey there, Gary, really nice talk. I really enjoyed it. I had a quick question on something you mentioned kind of early on, because I know that a lot of our folks are interested in it. So you mentioned that the proportion of postdocs at American institutions that are coming from outside the US has been growing over the past few decades. And I know that from our data in Boston, it's a really large proportion of our postdocs that are coming from outside the US, typically on non-immigrant visas. How do you think the fact that a large and also growing proportion of the population, especially here, are non-immigrant visa holding postdocs influences, let's say, policy decisions on the part of institutions, possibly on granting agencies, and also how we kind of make progress in terms of postdoc advocacy?
Really great question. One of the reasons that I love studying postdocs is that postdocs, I think, are not only there's not much data, but they're one of the most diverse in so many different ways populations. And part of that is the sort of nationality aspect. And also, being very frank that like being a British immigrant, I get treated very differently to immigrants from certain other countries, right? And that is articulated in surprising clarity sometimes by people. It's very clear. And so how that guides policy, my experience has been that broadly, when people are talking about broad postdoc issues, it's ignored. So one concrete example is one of the committees I sat on. Americans really don't like putting controls on things. They like the free market and, like, you know, individual choice and all this kind of thing. So they're like, well, we just have to convince fewer PhDs to go into a postdoc. So if we just tell our PhDs that they really should be thinking of not doing a postdoc, that will reduce the number of postdocs. And I said, no, it won't. How would that possibly have stopped me coming here to do a postdoc? All you will do, the number will stay the same or continue to increase. The number of Americans will decrease. And when your population starts to be all foreign and Americans are not becoming faculty, then some people are going to get very upset, right? So there's that level where people assume that all postdocs are essentially like white men from Harvard who are like, why am I struggling to get a faculty position, right? It also comes up in, you know, I've sort of pushed, right, for increasing opportunities, fellowships, and this kind of thing for foreign researchers. If this is a meritocracy and everyone's sort of allowed to compete in the same space, it's clearly not, because foreigners are banned from basically everything except the K-99. That usually always immediately brings up an argument of, well, if you do that, then you're going to push minorities out even further from applying for these things who are already underrepresented. And while that's correct, it sort of ignores the larger issue. It's sort of pitting groups against each other, right? It ignores the larger issue that this is a failure already, right? And it is not being addressed. And to say, well, if we change anything, it'll just make it worse, doesn't like set up that, yeah, it's not fixing the problem for anyone. So that comes up too. The other part is that people, when they do talk about foreigners, think all foreigners behave the same, and they behave very differently. And this also comes into like the advocacy efforts. I remember with the salary stuff that we were doing when I was still in Boston, there were people from certain countries who said, listen, this salary is better for us than it would be if we stayed in our own country. And the US is among the higher in the world, right? And also, we just need to be in the US for a while, and then go back, and then we will get a position pretty much guaranteed. And if you do this, there will be fewer jobs for us and like people like us. And you know, that argument, there are immigrants who look to stay through academia, and there are immigrants who look to be here just for a while in order to say that they've been here to then go back. And like, that's actually very common in Britain. That's like the sort of like Cambridge to Harvard to like Cambridge again pipeline that exists, right? And all these groups are behaving differently in like all sorts of different ways, and in ways that you don't expect. So for example, also when I'm talking about peer review, and postdocs doing peer review, it turns out that US immigration actually rewards you for doing peer review of journal articles, right? And people are like, oh, people are motivated to do this. I'm like, yes, like there are all these motivations, right, to do with immigration or like why you're here, that people don't think about, or they think of immigrants as a monolith, or not even immigrants, foreign researchers, right? No, right. So very long-winded answer to say it comes up in numerous different ways. Yeah.
Thanks. So I know we're past 5:15, so anyone who needs to hop off, feel free to do so. But maybe we have time for one more question for you, Gary. I know you said you had something at 5:30. So if anyone wants to get their final burning question in. Otherwise, I guess I had a quick question. So I can't remember which data set it was, but you showed the data that said like the median length of a postdoc is 2 years.
Yes.
I think the data that I didn't see there is there data on how many postdocs people do.
Right. So no, because people, the most we are getting is if they do more than one. I can sort of see that from the data outcomes. because we're not tracking individuals, certainly not through this way. And this is sort of where like the work that I'm thinking about with ORCID comes in. I'm trying to like track individuals more is, you know, I know of people personally who are on their 4th postdoc, right? So I know this is happening. I've seen it happen, but there is no way to prove it yet, right? Through that. So that's why I'm exploring the ORCID part, because it's not so much where people are ending up, but it doesn't necessarily say what happened in between. And I'm sort of curious to see how this conversation changes with the outcomes, because an outcome is essentially where are they now, but it ignores, you know, the longer space of time there has been. Like I certainly know from my own career, like it's been a very complex story in between those different places, right? And so where people have ended up, it's definitely an important data point, but there's also this complexity of how did they get there. So yeah, it's that it still eludes us, I'm afraid.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and thank you again for coming and talking to all of us. So we really appreciate it. So I guess everyone thank our speaker and have a good rest of your Thursday night. And thank you all for attending.